In the history, the Soviet army often carries a reputation for their crude equipment and mass tactics, and while this has always been a significant part of their land doctrine and way of war, there have been some very interesting visions that display a very different concept. Many of these ideas have been forgotten in the larger pictures. One of these are the teletanks, such as the TT-26, a simple but futuristic vehicle. These unmanned light tanks rolled through the harsh Finnish winter landscape, guided from a safe distance by their operators. In this video I'll be explaining how they came to be and why did they ultimately fail. In the 1930s, as war in Europe was over the horizon, the Soviet Union had also been modernizing its army. They had a variety of tanks in service, such as the PT series tanks and T-26 tanks. These vehicles had been tested in combat against the Imperial Japanese in the Far Eastern border clashes. In these skirmishes, the Soviet 45mm guns were proven to be very capable, but the armor in the vehicle was deemed to be quite weak, as even the light Japanese anti-tank weapons were capable of punching right through. This was possibly one of the reasons why the teletank concept was put on the drawing table. With these tanks, the crew could be ditched entirely to reduce the effects of the weak armor, as the crew inside was prone to injuries during combat. The concept seemed good on paper. There was only one problem. How do you control a tank if there's no crew inside it? This question would be solved with a complex radio system to operate the weapons and maneuver the tanks. A crew inside another tank further back would be the ones to control the teletank in battle. They would essentially give it radio commands to do certain actions with a remote control. One of these options was a self-destruction command. When not in combat, these tanks could be driven manually. As you know if you watched my previous video, drones were not a completely new idea at this time, but the technology was still quite fresh, and I think it's safe to say that the 1930s Soviet Union was not a leading power in this field. But nevertheless, at least 2 teletanks battalions were ready by 1939. Some of these tanks were equipped with flamethrowers and machine guns, others carried several hundred kilograms of timed explosives that could be dropped to enemy positions once close. The bases for these tanks were either T-18, T-26, T-36 or the PT series of tanks. As the Winter War began between the Soviet Union and Finland, the Soviets would finally have a chance to test their new weapon in combat. This is where the history gets quite blurry, as it's quite hard to find factual sources that really tell how these tanks worked. But at least one thing is clear, the remote control system was not very reliable, as it's said if the connection was lost, for example the teletanks got too far from their operators, they would just simply stop and be idle, not providing any combat value. But at the same time, the remote controlled lumbering metal box with the flamethrower was understandably deemed quite scary by the Finns. It's very likely that the combat effectiveness was also hindered by the harsh winterland and poor ability to get a good idea what was actually going on near the vehicle. But the fact that this family of tanks would not be used by the Soviets later during World War II is evidence by itself that these tanks could not provide what was hoped. The Soviet army resorted using only conventional crude tanks in the future. Yet it's still a concept that continues to spark interest in many militaries to this day. As recently as 2019, the Soviet Union, Russia, has been showing their new remote-controlled tracked combat vehicles, the Uran-9, in public. But there are also many other countries, such as the United States and China, that have showed interest in this field during the recent years. Do you think this type of weapon can ever overcome its weaknesses, or is it forever deemed to be too far-fetched idea to be effective?